Welcome to Blind History with Josh Berry. Over the next few weeks, we will be diving into the history of Egypt. Here is the full article, Part 6. Ptolemaic Egypt and Cleopatra the Ptolemaic Egypt was the final phase of independent Egyptian rule before Roman annexation, and it was one of the most remarkable political and cultural experiments in the ancient world. Founded by one of Alexander the Great's generals, the Ptolemaic dynasty ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries, blending Greek and Egyptian traditions into a kingdom that was at once deeply local and thoroughly Mediterranean. Its history is the story of extraordinary intellectual brilliance, economic power, and cultural fusion, but also of mounting strain, social division, and political collapse. Cleopatra the dynasty's most famous ruler, embodied both its strengths and its final crisis. Completing the Ptolemaic story. By the middle of the 2nd century BCE, Ptolemaic Egypt faced mounting internal and external pressures that steadily eroded the confidence and stability of the kingdom. The early Ptolemies had built a powerful state that controlled agriculture, monopolized industries, and projected influence throughout the eastern Mediterranean. But the very machinery that had made the kingdom strong also made it vulnerable. Dynastic conflict, fiscal strain, social resentment, and foreign rivalry all began to work together against it. One of the most damaging features of Ptolemaic politics was the dynasty's habit of repeated family conflict. Royal succession was rarely smooth, and the court often became a battlefield of competing brothers, sisters, mothers, sons, and ambitious ministers. These struggles were not merely private quarrels. They shaped the fate of the state itself. Each succession crisis weakened authority, encouraged factionalism, and invited outside interference. Over time, the dynasty's own family structure became one of the main reasons it could no longer govern effectively. At the same time, the kingdom's economic system came under growing strain. Ptolemaic rulers maintained a tightly managed economy with state control over agriculture, taxation, and many forms of production. That system had once generated immense wealth, but it also depended on efficient administration and political stability. When corruption spread, when officials abused their power, and when local resentment deepened, the state found it harder to keep revenues flowing. Heavy taxation and burdensome labor obligations made the rural majority increasingly restive, especially in Upper Egypt. The dynasty also had to contend with the limits of imperial overreach. The Ptolemies had long sought to dominate the eastern Mediterranean through wars with the Seleucid Empire and other rivals, but those conflicts became harder to sustain over time. Their foreign policy successes were often temporary, and each generation faced the consequences of the last one's ambitions. By the later Hellenistic period, Rome had become the dominant power in the region, and Egypt's rulers increasingly found themselves maneuvering not as equals, but as anxious clients trying to preserve autonomy. Society under Ptolemaic rule. Ptolemaic society was divided sharply along ethnic, linguistic, and class lines, though those divisions were never completely fixed. The kingdom was ruled by a Macedonian Greek dynasty, and the ruling elite remained largely Greek in language and culture. Yet most of the population was still Egyptian, and daily life in the Nile Valley remained rooted in long-standing local traditions. The Greek and Macedonian elite formed a privileged minority concentrated in Alexandria, Naucratis, and other Hellenistic settlements. They enjoyed access to Greek law, gymnasia, theaters, and land grants. Greek remained the language of administration, high culture, and royal business. This elite saw itself as the natural ruling class and formed the backbone of the kingdom's army, bureaucracy, and court culture. The Egyptian majority lived very differently. Rural villagers and provincial townspeople bore the heaviest taxes and labor demands. They used Egyptian courts for many local matters, continued to speak Egyptian in its later forms, and sustained the temple economies that remained so important to the country's social and religious life. Egyptian priests were often the most influential figures in local communities, and they preserved demotic writing, ritual traditions, and pharaonic religious practice. Between these two broad groups stood a large and growing mixed population. Some Egyptians learned Greek in order to enter administrative or commercial life. Some Greek settlers adopted Egyptian gods, especially through cults like Serapis and Isis. In urban spaces, people increasingly moved between cultural worlds, even if social inequality remained pronounced. This middle zone did not erase division, but it did make the kingdom more flexible than a simple Greek rulers over Egyptian subjects model would suggest. That flexibility also created tensions. Greek settlers sometimes acted with arrogance or took advantage of their status, and Egyptian resentment could quickly turn into hostility. At the same time, the very existence of bilingual officials, syncretic cults, and mixed communities shows that the kingdom was not locked into absolute separation. Ptolemaic Egypt was a society of hierarchy and blending at once, and that combination gave it both strength and instability. Alexandria at its zenith. No city better symbolized the greatness of Ptolemaic Egypt than Alexandria. Founded by Alexander and developed by the Ptolemies, it became the commercial, political, and intellectual capital of the Hellenistic world. By the time of Cleopatra the Alexandria was one of the largest cities in the Mediterranean, a place where sailors, merchants, scholars, priests, and courtiers all moved through a dense and cosmopolitan urban environment. Alexandria's harbors were essential to the kingdom's wealth. Egypt's grain exports made the city a crucial node in Mediterranean trade, and its location allowed the Ptolemies to project maritime power as well as terrestrial authority. The city also served as the administrative heart of the dynasty, housing the royal palace, official offices, military personnel, and the elaborate ceremonial world of the court. Yet Alexandria was not only a political and commercial center. Aegean Rossi was port point over the Exodus. It was also the great intellectual capital of its age. The library and the museum drew scholars from across the Greek world and beyond. Royal patronage made scholarship into a matter of state prestige. The kings wanted knowledge, but they also wanted the reputation that came with hosting the world's greatest center of learning. The library grew through aggressive collecting. Ancient accounts describe royal agents acquiring scrolls through purchase, copying, and sometimes even confiscation from visiting ships. Whether every story is literally true or not, the broader point remains. The Ptolemies were determined to gather and organize knowledge on a scale unmatched by earlier rulers. Texts in poetry, drama, history, philosophy, medicine, astronomy, and geography were studied and cataloged, and Alexandria became a place where scholarly work could flourish under royal support. Among the most famous scholars associated with Alexandria were Euclid, Eratosthenes, and Callimachus. Euclid's Elements gave mathematics a formal structure that would influence later generations for centuries. Eratosthenes calculated the Earth's circumference with remarkable accuracy, showing the intellectual ambition of Alexandrian science. Callimachus helped develop systems of cataloging and literary criticism that shaped the organization of knowledge itself. Alexandria was also a literary center. Poets such as Theocritus and Apollonius of Rhodes gave Hellenistic literature new forms and new sophistication. Jewish scholars in the city later produced the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, one of the most important translations in world history. Egyptian priestly traditions also entered Alexandrian intellectual life, especially through historical writing, calendrical knowledge, and religious interpretation. The city was therefore not simply Greek. It was a meeting place where Greek, Egyptian, Jewish, and other traditions interacted in ways that changed the ancient world. The Pharaoh's lighthouse, one of the seven wonders of the ancient world, became a symbol of this ambition. It guided ships into the harbor, but it also stood as a monument to the dynasty's cosmopolitan self-image. Alexandria wanted to be seen as a city of light, learning, and maritime power. Its brilliance reflected the confidence of the early Ptolemies and the global importance of their kingdom. Yet Alexandria was also volatile. Its population was mixed, ambitious, and politically sensitive. Greeks, Jews, Egyptians, and others lived in close proximity, and tensions over religion, citizenship, privilege, and resources could erupt into conflict. The city's energy made it extraordinary, but it also made it difficult to control. Court intrigue and urban unrest were constant features of Ptolemaic politics. Ptolemaic foundations. The dynasty's founder, Ptolemy I Soter, was one of Alexander's most capable generals. After Alexander's death, Ptolemy secured Egypt as his own power base and eventually declared himself king around 305 BCE, following the fragmentation of Alexander's empire among the Diadochi. His greatest achievement was not simply survival, but institution building. He created a kingdom that could endure long after the empire of Alexander had fallen apart. Ptolemy's political genius lay in his ability to speak to two worlds at once. To Greek settlers, he offered familiar institutions, Greek civic culture, and a monarchy that could protect their privileges. To Egyptians, he presented himself as a pharaoh, a king who respected the gods and honored temple traditions. This dual strategy gave his rule a flexibility that many other successor kingdoms lacked. The seizure of Alexander's body was one of his most brilliant, symbolic acts. By bringing Alexander's remains to Egypt, Ptolemy associated himself with the conqueror's legacy and turned Egypt into the resting place of empire. That gesture was not just a claim to succession. It was a statement that Ptolemy's Egypt was the rightful heir to Alexander's world. Ptolemy first also reorganized Egypt's economy with remarkable rigor. Much of the land became royal domain, leased out under state supervision. Key goods such as oil, papyrus, and salt were controlled through monopolies that generated enormous revenue. Greek clerics, or soldier settlers, received land grants in exchange for military service, tying the army directly to the economic life of the kingdom. Temples retained a degree of autonomy, but they also became part of the fiscal system and had to negotiate their place within the new order. This made the Ptolemaic state unusually strong, but also unusually intrusive. It reached deep into agriculture, taxation, and record-keeping. The monarchy could draw on vast resources, but it also had to maintain a complex administrative system that never lost sight of the land, labor, and grain on which the kingdom depended. The middle kingdom of the Ptolemies, Ptolemy II Philadelphus, expanded and refined the kingdom his father had built. His reign is often remembered as a high point of Ptolemaic power, and for good reason. He strengthened Alexandria, patronized scholarship, promoted royal cult, and made Egypt a major player in Hellenistic politics. One of the most striking features of his reign was the use of royal ideology to create a new kind of monarchy. Ptolemy II married his sister Arsinoe II, and the couple was deified as the sibling gods. That marriage was shocking by Greek standards, but it fit with Egyptian religious patterns in which royal siblings could evoke divine pairings such as Isis and Osiris. The dynasty used this fusion deliberately to bind Greek, and Egyptian traditions together in a single monarchy. Ptolemy II also strengthened maritime power and expanded trade. Alexandria's ports, the Nile system, and connections to the Red Sea gave the kingdom access to a vast commercial network. The famous lighthouse at Pharos symbolized not only navigational skill, but also the wider confidence of the dynasty. The Ptolemies saw themselves as rulers of a kingdom that extended across sea routes, caravan routes, and grain-producing land. The Middle Ptolemaic period, however, was not only an age of confidence, it was also the beginning of more visible tension. As the dynasty expanded its influence, it relied increasingly on military settlements and complex fiscal systems. The benefits of royal power remained real, but so did the burdens imposed on the population. Native Egyptians carried much of the tax load, and the distinction between urban privilege and rural hardship became more pronounced. War and pressure. Foreign policy became another source of strain. The Ptolemies fought a long series of conflicts with the Seleucid Empire, known as the Syrian Wars. These wars revolved around control of Palestine, Phoenicia, and the Eastern Mediterranean corridor, and they mattered because they shaped both trade and prestige. At different moments, the Ptolemies could be quite successful. Their fleets were strong, their diplomacy was flexible, and they could exploit the rivalries of the Hellenistic world. But the Seleucids had larger territorial resources, and over time the balance shifted against Egypt. Each war cost money, manpower, and political stability. Victory could temporarily strengthen the kingdom, but defeat could leave deep consequences. The pressure of war also fed social tension inside Egypt. Military recruitment, taxation, and the settlement of soldiers on land all created resentment among local communities. The state was extracting more and more in order to preserve its international position. The result was a kingdom that looked powerful from outside, but increasingly brittle from within. This process became especially serious once Rome entered the Eastern Mediterranean as a great power. Rome's victories over Carthage and Macedonia altered the strategic environment. Egyptian rulers could no longer assume that the Hellenistic world was a closed competition among Greek and Macedonian dynasties. A new power had arrived, one with vastly greater staying power than any of the successor kingdoms. At first, Rome posed itself as a friend or referee, but such friendship was often a cover for influence. Roman arbitration in dynastic matters, Roman expectations about grain supply, and Roman political intervention all gradually mirrored the room for Egyptian independence. The descent into dynastic chaos. From Ptolemy V onward, the dynasty became increasingly unstable. Royal succession was often marked by violence, manipulation, and the routine use of family members as political weapons. Brothers, sisters, mothers, and sons all became part of a brutal struggle for power. The old claim that the Ptolemies represented a stable divine monarchy increasingly rang hollow. Ptolemy VI, Ptolemy VIII, and their relatives engaged in prolonged rivalries that weakened the monarchy from within. Marriage within the dynasty became a political tool meant to preserve bloodline legitimacy, but it often intensified the very conflicts it was supposed to control. The court became more dangerous, and the monarchy looked less like a unified institution than a battlefield of competing claims. These conflicts were not just personal. They had economic and regional consequences. Different family members could gain support in different parts of the kingdom, and rival courts could emerge around competing claimants. Local elites, mercenaries, priests, and foreign allies all became involved in dynastic struggles. That made the state less coherent and more dependent on outside assistance. By the 1st century BCE, Ptolemaic Egypt was still rich, still impressive, and still strategically important, but it was no longer a dominant Mediterranean power. Its rulers increasingly needed Roman support to maintain their positions, and that dependence would prove fatal. Ptolemy XII and the Roman shadow. Ptolemy XII Auletes, Cleopatra VII's father, symbolizes the dynasty's late decline. He is remembered as a warrior who relied heavily on Roman backing, and he spent enormous sums securing his position. His nickname, Auletes, meaning flute player, carried an unflattering implication of weakness and showmanship. Ptolemy XII's reign showed just how dependent Egypt had become on the Roman world. He bribed Roman leaders, paid for recognition, and sought to present himself as a useful ally rather than a sovereign equal. This bought him temporary security, but it came at a huge cost. Egypt's treasury weakened, and the dynasty's independence eroded further. He was also politically vulnerable at home. Exiled more than once, he was forced to rely on foreign and mercenary support to regain the throne. Such dependence made him even less popular with his own subjects. The monarchy's legitimacy continued to rest on ancient forms and temple rituals, but the practical basis of power was now in severe decline. When Ptolemy XII died, he left his young children, Cleopatra VII and Ptolemy XIII, as joint rulers. That arrangement was supposed to preserve dynastic continuity. Instead, it created the conditions for one of the most famous political dramas in ancient history. Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh. Cleopatra VII Philopatra was born in 69 BCE into a kingdom that still possessed grandeur, but had lost much of its independence. She was the first Ptolemy known to have learned Egyptian, and she was far more politically and intellectually gifted than the caricatures later attached to her in Roman propaganda. She grew up in the court world that demanded both symbolic sophistication and practical intelligence, and she excelled at both. She understood the languages of power better than most rulers of her time. She could speak Greek, and she could present herself in Egyptian terms as a legitimate pharaoh. She also understood that Egypt's survival now depended on navigating the Roman political order, not resisting it blindly. That gave her reign an unusual mixture of confidence and desperation. Early in her reign, she was pushed aside by her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, and forced into exile. But Cleopatra was not content to disappear. She regrouped, gathered support, and returned to challenge him. Her willingness to act decisively is one reason she remains such a compelling figure. She was not merely a victim of circumstance. She was an active political operator, trying to save a collapsing kingdom. Caesar's intervention. Julius Caesar's arrival in Egypt during his pursuit of Pompey brought him directly into Cleopatra VII's struggle with Ptolemy XIII. The famous story of Cleopatra smuggling herself into Caesar's presence, whether literally true or later embellished, captures an important truth. She understood the need for theatrical as well as strategic action. Her alliance with Caesar was both political and personal. Caesar needed Egyptian grain, stability, and a resolution to the dynastic conflict. Cleopatra needed military support and a path back to the throne. Their partnership served both interests. Caesar defeated the forces of Ptolemy XIII, who died during the conflict, and installed Cleopatra as queen alongside her younger brother, Ptolemy XIV. The birth of Caesarion, her son by Caesar, added another layer to the story. Cleopatra clearly intended him to represent a new dynastic future, one that could tie Egypt more closely to Rome while preserving her own legitimacy. The child symbolized her ambition to keep Egypt sovereign through a political link to the Roman world. Cleopatra later visited Rome, where she was housed at Caesar's villa, and became a source of both fascination and alarm. To some Romans, she looked like a queen of extraordinary intelligence and charisma. To others, she was a dangerous Eastern monarch, drawing Caesar into foreign entanglements. After Caesar's assassination, the political landscape changed again, and Cleopatra returned to Egypt determined to secure her position and protect Caesarion's future. Antony and the Eastern Dream. Mark Antony's relationship with Cleopatra became the next great turning point. Their alliance had political origins, but it also grew into a partnership of shared interests and shared ambitions. Antony needed Eastern resources, and Cleopatra needed a protector powerful enough to defend Egypt against Roman rivals. Together, they imagined a political order in which Egypt and the eastern provinces could form a strong counterweight to the growing influence of Octavian. The famous meeting at Tarsus marked the beginning of this phase. Cleopatra presented herself with all the theatrical brilliance for which she became famous, arriving as a ruler who understood performance as a tool of diplomacy. Antony, like Caesar before him, was drawn into the political orbit of an extraordinary woman who knew how to stage power. The donations of Alexandria, in which Antony granted territories and titles to Cleopatra and her children, were among the most controversial events of the age. Cleopatra's son Caesarion was named king of Egypt in the east, while her other children received lands and honors in the eastern Mediterranean. These grants were politically provocative because they seemed to transform the Roman East into a quasi-Ptolemaic Rome under Cleopatra's influence. Roman propaganda seized on this. Octavian and his allies portrayed Cleopatra as a decadent foreign queen, seducing Antony and threatening Roman order. The political conflict was framed as a moral one, a struggle between Roman discipline and Eastern luxury. That rhetoric helped turn the coming war into something larger than a dynastic contest. It became a civilizational drama in Roman eyes. Actium and the end of the dynasty. The final war between Antony and Octavian culminated in the naval battle of Actium in 31 BC. Antony's fleet was defeated, and the political future of Egypt was effectively sealed. Cleopatra and Antony retreated to Alexandria, where they attempted to regroup, but the outcome had already become clear. Antony's death and Cleopatra's suicide remain among the most famous moments in ancient history. The details vary depending on the source, but the broad sequence is consistent. Antony died after the defeat. Cleopatra realized that Octavian would not allow her to remain independent, and she chose death over humiliation. Her death in 30 BCE ended the Ptolemaic dynasty, and with it, the long tradition of pharaonic independence. Whether she died by asp, poison, or another means has long fascinated later writers, but the exact mechanism matters less than the political reality. Cleopatra refused to be paraded as a captive in Octavian's triumph. She preserved her dignity through death, even as the kingdom she had tried so hard to save disappeared into the Roman Empire. Caesarion was also killed, eliminating the last possible dynastic rival who could claim to continue the Ptolemaic line in Egypt. Rome annexed the country as a personal possession of Octavian, later Augustus, and Egypt became one of the most valuable provinces in the empire. His grain fed Rome. Its wealth supported imperial administration. Its old political independence was gone. Cleopatra's legacy. Cleopatra's image has often been shaped more by Roman propaganda and later literature than by her actual achievements. She became a symbol of seduction, luxury, and Eastern danger in Roman memory, especially once Octavian had defeated her and needed to justify his victory. Shakespeare, later European art, and popular culture continued to emphasize romance and tragedy over administration and statecraft. That is unfortunate, because Cleopatra was far more than a romantic figure. She was a skilled ruler who understood economics, diplomacy, religious symbolism, and cultural legitimacy. She likely knew Egyptian better than any earlier Ptolemaic ruler, and she carefully presented herself in pharaonic and divine terms. Her association with Isis was not superficial. It was part of her effort to root her rule in Egyptian theology and monarchy. She also ruled during a period of real difficulty and managed, for a time, to stabilize the kingdom. She navigated Rome with intelligence, resisted total subordination, and tried to preserve Egyptian sovereignty in a world that was rapidly becoming Roman. That she failed does not make her insignificant. It makes her one of the most important last defenders of an ancient political order. The Ptolemaic legacy. The Ptolemaic period's true legacy lies in its cultural synthesis. Greek and Egyptian traditions did not simply coexist. They interacted, fused, and transformed one another. The result was a civilization that influenced the ancient world long after the dynasty itself disappeared. Art in the Ptolemaic period often blended Greco-Roman naturalism with Egyptian symbolism. Religious life became increasingly syncretic, with gods such as Serapis and Isis traveling far beyond Egypt's borders. Bilingual documents like the Rosetta Stone preserved the layered linguistic reality of the kingdom and later made possible the decipherment of hieroglyphs in the modern era. Alexandria remained a major center of learning, trade, and cosmopolitan culture under Roman rule and beyond. The dynasty also left behind a political lesson. Egypt's rulers showed that an ancient civilization could adapt to foreign rule without disappearing. They created a kingdom that was neither fully Greek nor fully Egyptian, but something new and historically powerful. Even in decline, the Ptolemies proved that Egypt remained central to the imagination and politics of the Mediterranean world. That is why Cleopatra VII remained so compelling. She was the final ruler of a dynasty that had spent centuries balancing two worlds. She inherited a kingdom that was both brilliant and unstable, and she tried to save it through intelligence, performance, diplomacy, and force. Her defeat did not erase the achievements of the dynasty. It made them part of a larger Roman and global legacy. Next, we will be exploring Roman and Byzantine Egypt, Christianization, joined by our resident Egyptian expert. Join us next time on Blind History with Josh Berry.